Before the Black Mafia family became a national name, Detroit had Young Boys Incorporated.
YBI did not become notorious simply because it sold heroin.
It became notorious because its leaders treated a street organization like a corporation, layers of command, separate work locations, branded products, and young runners who helped protect the people at the top. At the center of the story was Milton Butch Jones. But here is the first fact that often gets lost online: Jones was not the only founder. University of Michigan researchers identify 4 men at the top: Dwayne "Wonderful" Wayne Davis, Raymond "Baby" Ray Peoples, Mark "Block" Marshall, and Jones.
Jones later became the de facto leader and the organization's central strategist.
Tonight, we are separating the documented history from street legend, how YBI grew, how it used Detroit's young people, why federal authorities struggled to dismantle it, and how Jones's story ended decades later.
This is not a celebration.
It is a story about organization, power, and the damage left behind.
To understand YBI, start with Detroit in the late 1970s.
The city was losing industrial jobs and population.
Many neighborhoods faced disinvestment, abandoned property, and fewer legal paths to stable money.
Heroin was already present, but the street economy was changing. Young people could see expensive clothes, cars, and jewelry while families around them struggled.
That contrast mattered.
University of Michigan's historical project says YBI membership became a status symbol and that the promise of quick money attracted teenagers living amid poverty.
None of that excuses the choices that followed. It explains the recruiting environment.
YBI offered a distorted version of opportunity, income, identity, protection, and a sense of belonging, all tied to an illegal business that depended on addiction and fear.
In other words, the organization did not create Detroit's economic crisis. It exploited it. And that is what made the model dangerous. YBI could turn social abandonment into a labor pool. Milton Davis Jones was born in 1955.
In his later autobiography, Jones described growing up around violence, poverty, and drug sales. That book is his account, not an independent court record, so its personal claims must be treated carefully. What is supported by historical research is that Jones joined forces with Davis, Peoples, and Marshall as YBI emerged around 1978.
Jones brought strict rules and an obsession with efficiency.
Researchers describe him as the most militant of the 4 and say he became the organization's de facto leader after leaving prison. His influence came from more than street reputation.
Jones thought in systems. People had to find jobs.
Money, narcotics, and distribution were separated across different properties.
Leaders stayed away from many street-level transactions.
Jones appears to have understood a basic principle of risk. The farther command is removed from the corner, the harder it is for one arrest to reveal the whole structure.
Even the name Young Boys Incorporated announced the strategy. It sounded like a company because the organization wanted to operate like one.
Federal agents later described a military-style chart, an inner circle at the top, lieutenants beneath them, and runners handling sales. A Sixth Circuit opinion called YBI a sophisticated organization that assigned different tasks to different members and maintained an ongoing structure. The court record also says its primary business was heroin and cocaine, and that heroin was sold in small envelopes carrying a recognizable 18 logo.
That branding mattered. A customer did not just.
The most disturbing part of the YBI model was not a side detail. It was the use of minors as runners. Historical records and the 1982 federal indictment said young people were used to distribute narcotics. A federal hearing quoted by the University of Michigan project explained why authorities had trouble penetrating the organization. Most of the street-level members were juveniles. At the same time, Michigan had one of the country's harshest drug laws for adults. The so-called 650 lifer law allowed life sentences for possession or distribution of 650 grams or more of narcotics. By placing children closer to the product and adults farther away, YBI exploited the gap between juvenile and adult punishment. The teenagers carried the greatest immediate risk: arrest, violence, addiction in their families, and lost futures, while the leadership tried to remain insulated. That is not youthful entrepreneurship. It is the organized use of children as protection for adults.
YBI sold an image along with its product.
Expensive cars, jewelry, and fashionable coats made membership visible. The University of Michigan history notes that Max Julien jackets became so closely associated with the organization that people called them young boy jackets. Jones's autobiography also claimed that members were forbidden to use the product because leaders wanted workers alert and dependable. Again, that specific rule comes from Jones's own account, but it fits the wider documented emphasis on discipline.
Enforcement was another matter.
Researchers describe a wrecking crew managed under Jones and say violence and retaliation were used to control members and frighten competitors. A federal appellate opinion likewise states that YBI used violence and murder to reduce competition and enforce discipline. The appearance of success drew young people in, the threat of violence helped keep the machine working. Behind the cars and clothing were neighborhoods absorbing addiction, intimidation, incarceration, and death. YBI's Detroit operations were concentrated largely on the city's west side. The network used multiple properties and kept drugs, money, packaging, and distribution in separate locations. Think about what that accomplished. A search at one house might uncover cash but not the entire supply. A runner might know a lieutenant but not the supplier. A lieutenant might know one location but not every property. The hierarchy limited how much any one person could reveal. It also made the operation replaceable. If a street seller disappeared, another young person could take the position without changing the command structure. This is why the story cannot be reduced to one charismatic leader. Butch Jones mattered, but the system mattered more. YBI's real innovation was turning people and locations into interchangeable parts. That helped it expand and made ordinary street policing less effective. To dismantle the structure, investigators needed informants, financial records, surveillance, and evidence connecting the separate layers. By 1982, federal authorities moved against the organization. University of Michigan researchers report that 40 YBI affiliates were indicted in the first federal crackdown and that 32 were later convicted and sentenced on drug charges. The investigation connected 41 people to narcotics offenses and uncovered nearly $2 million in cash and jewelry, according to the Historical Project. Contemporary reporting described a heroin ring that used people under 18 to sell narcotics and generated enormous daily revenue. Dollar estimates from that period vary wildly, so the safest conclusion is not a sensational number. The documented point is that this was a large, profitable network. In 1983, convictions substantially reduced YBI's activity, including the conviction of Jones. But the structure did not simply vanish. The court record says the organization later resumed operations, with prosecutors alleging that Jones continued directing activity from a federal prison in Texas through his wife, Portia, and other members. The later case shows why the first crackdown was not the final chapter. A 1989 Sixth Circuit decision says young boys continued operating until 1987. It describes a renewed investigation and a July 1987 grand jury indictment of 26 people, followed by racketeering and heroin conspiracy charges. The government's theory was that the same enterprise survived through changing crews and separate conspiracies. The appellate court agreed that evidence of an ongoing organization and structure satisfied the legal definition of an enterprise. That finding is important. YBI was not merely a collection of independent dealers using the same name. In the court's view, it had continuity, assigned roles, and a structure that lasted beyond individual transactions. The organization could lose members, pause, and resume because the blueprint remained. That blueprint insulated leaders, disciplined crews, branded street products, and replaceable runners became part of YBI's wider legacy. It is tempting to end the story with the 1980s convictions. But Butch Jones returned to federal court years later. According to a federal court opinion, Jones admitted directing a separate marijuana organization known as the Dog Pound from 1995 through 2001. He admitted supervising at least 5 people in narcotics activity and participating in plans to rob and kidnap other drug dealers. The case involved at least 5 kilograms of cocaine stolen during one robbery. For sentencing purposes, Jones testified that murders committed by people he directed were reasonably foreseeable. He pleaded guilty in January 2006 to operating a continuing criminal enterprise. A cooperation provision reduced the recommended sentence from life under the guideline calculation to 30 years. On May 12, 2008, the federal court sentenced him to 360 months, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Those are court-documented facts, separate from YBI folklore. Jones eventually left federal custody near the end of 2025 and entered a halfway house, according to Detroit reporting. On January 7, 2026, Milton Butch Jones died at age 70. His funeral home obituary confirms the date. Reports attributed his death to a heart attack, though the brief public obituary did not give a cause. By then, the name YBI had been repeated in documentaries, books, music, and online videos for decades. That attention can blur the line between history and mythology. Some claims about market share, weekly revenue, internal executions, or exactly who founded the first crew conflict across sources. That is why this story relies most heavily on court opinions, federal records, contemporary reporting, and the University of Michigan's archival project. A dramatic story becomes more powerful when the facts are strong enough to stand without exaggeration. YBI's lasting impact was not simply that it sold a large amount of heroin. Detroit already had drug trafficking before YBI, and other organizations followed. What changed was the deliberate fusion of corporate structure, youth recruitment, product branding, geographic separation, and violent discipline. The model made a neighborhood drug network harder to investigate and easier to reproduce. But every apparent efficiency transferred harm to someone else. Children carried the legal and physical danger. Residents lived beside sales locations in retaliation. People with addiction became repeat customers. Families lost relatives to prison, violence, and drugs. Law enforcement crackdowns then swept broadly through black neighborhoods, sometimes reinforcing fear and stereotypes far beyond proven YBI membership. Both realities belong in the same history. YBI exploited communities, and the response could also criminalize an entire generation of young black Detroiters. Context does not erase accountability. Accountability without context fails to explain how the cycle took hold. So, was Butch Jones the leader of YBI? The most accurate answer is yes, but not the lone founder and not the whole story. Jones became the de facto leader and helped impose the system that made the organization unusually durable. Davis, Peoples, Marshall, Portia Jones, suppliers, lieutenants, and hundreds of young runners were also part of the history. YBI grew because Detroit's street economy offered fast money where the legal economy had withdrawn opportunity. It survived because the organization protected leadership and made young people replaceable. And it fell because investigators eventually connected the layers, while violence and prosecution consumed the network from within. The lesson is bigger than one man. When a system rewards exploitation, removing one leader does not remove the conditions that produce the organization. If you want more Detroit stories examined with facts, context, and straight talk, subscribe to Couch Watch with Ken and turn on notifications. In the comments, tell me which Detroit case or organization we should investigate next.